Today we will be looking at Chinese and Korean art after 1279, and as we do so we'll be asking, what is the literati style? We'll explore its relationship to the scholarly life in later Chinese and Korean art. We'll also look at the significance of landscape painting in Chinese and Korean painting, and assess the influence of court life and patronage on art in China and Korea, and we'll look at the distinction between court painting and literati painting. And finally, we'll analyze and learn to characterize the emergence of expression beyond representation as a valued aspect of art in China and Korea from the 13th century to the present. So how is expression beyond representation important? We're starting with the Yuan dynasty. Chinese history is defined by the different dynasties that ruled throughout history. The Yuan dynasty began in the early 1200s, and the Yuan dynasty was actually, in fact, a dynasty of foreign rulers, the Mongols. Now, if you were to guess the name of a conquering invader from Mongolia, who would you guess? If you said Genghis Khan, you are correct. So here's the map of China, and this is Mongolia up here. And the Mongol invaders came down from the north. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai, proclaimed himself Emperor of China in 1279, and he founded the Yuan dynasty. For the Chinese, these outsiders were barbarians, in contrast to their own sophisticated culture. Chinese spiritual resistance to the Mongols came through the development of intellectually challenging and authentically Chinese philosophy. So they resisted, and through their sophisticated intellectual thought. Beijing, here in the north, became the Mongol capital, but the cultural centers of the south, where the previous Song dynasty had ruled, remained strong. So culture was divided. During the Song dynasty that I just mentioned, painting had achieved the same status as the other important literati arts, which were poetry and calligraphy. Calligraphy was considered higher than painting for a long time. These were the three pursuits appropriate for the literati class, and even emperors would paint. So here we see calligraphy and painting. The literati, or the scholarly class in China, existed because of the system of examinations that was used to gather the cream of the crop in Chinese society. And those who passed the examinations would work for the government, but very few people passed. This examination system went back to the 9th century, and the exams were extremely difficult. And although very few people passed, a whole culture of an intellectual class built up around the exams. And this is the development of the literati, or the scholarly class. So we'll see two different kinds of artistic production in China after 1279. And on the one hand, the literati, the scholarly class, emphasized personal expression and the harmony of mind and nature. On the other hand, art made for the imperial courts, shown here, is more decorative and more pleasing to the customer, in a sense. The literati were interested in their personal individual expression, the little guy on the mountaintop with poetry in the sky, versus the court style. So we'll look at the difference between those two. The intellectual elite did not consider themselves laborers who needed to make a living with their craft, so they had the luxury of developing their own standards of artistic excellence, not the standards of the court. The literati felt that working for a patron tainted their art with money, and there are similarities between that mindset and the mindset of many artists today. Whereas artists we've seen in Europe up to this point have almost all worked for patrons, today many artists call selling your work selling out. And this raises an interesting question. Do you think that the individual expression of an artist is the thing that matters most? Or does that make the artist too individualistic and narcissistic? On the one hand, if it were not for the desires of the patron, we would not have the Sistine Chapel, because Michelangelo did not even like painting. Pope Julius II pretty much had to force him to paint the Sistine Chapel. And on the other hand, many artists today often feel that patrons force the artist to be too beholden to an audience, to a consumer culture, rather than to their own personal artistic integrity and vision. Think about this question as we compare the literati painting and the court painting in this period in China. In China, the literati felt, as I've mentioned, that they were superior to professional paintings, those painters who worked for the court. This Mongol intrusion, this Yuan dynasty, still patronized the art, and a lot of great art was made. But the Yuan abolished the scholarly examination, so the scholars were basically on their own. So they did not paint for the public, but they painted for their friends. For this reason, they did not make wall paintings, but created hand scrolls, like these shown here. Objects that were small enough that they could travel lightly and share with their friends. So the scrolls also bore the seals of all of the people who had owned them, all the collectors who had owned them throughout history. Nizan used a dry brush technique in which a brush is almost dry instead of heavy and wet with ink. It gives the painting a light touch, a simplicity associated with a noble spirit. Since the literati did not need to please patrons, one of their values was to paint as play and for the joy of painting, without worrying about reaching some unattainable standard. Ni lived a reclusive lifestyle outside of society. And this too reminds us of avant-garde artists today who try to, or sometimes see themselves as outside of society in some way. The Ming Dynasty was ruled by a despotic ruler, so that was subsequent to the Yuan dynasty. And this despotic ruler succeeded in driving out the Mongols from China, but he was from an uneducated peasant class, and so he distrusted the scholars. He, at the same time, reinstated the scholarly exams, but there was still a divide between the literati and the government, and so court painting looked different than literati painting once again. Let's see, here we go. So Yin Hong's hundreds of birds admiring peacocks exemplifies the difference between literati and court painting, as we've mentioned. It's more brightly colored, great attention to detail. It's a large format, unlike the small hand scrolls, and it depicts a popular genre of the birds and flower genre, which is a popular style in the Song Academy. The bold landscape pictured here would also influence later landscape painting in Japan that we'll see in the next chapter. Ceramics was very popular with the newly rich merchant class at this point, as well as with the court. And the interesting thing about the blue and white wares here, representative of Ming ceramics, is that the technique was highly desired in Europe, but not discovered until the 18th century. The dragon, shown in the negative space, depicted on this vessel, is an imperial symbol. And so, turning to the Forbidden City, what we now know as the Forbidden City was rebuilt in the 18th century, but the original plan is based on Mongol precedents, so this goes back very far. The Mongols lived in the entire northern side of Beijing, and the Chinese lived in the southern third. And during the Ming Dynasty, emperors and officials lived in the northern or inner city, and commoners lived in the outer city. Only those on official business could enter the Forbidden City that was in the center of the inner city. So the city of Beijing is laid out on a grid, and it uses the principles of Feng Shui. Feng Shui means wind and water. We know it as a way of arranging an interior space, and it guided the construction of the plan of this city. Evil comes from the north, which pretty much was true when you think about the fact that the Mongolian invaders came from the north. You see Beijing here, which is where the Forbidden City is, and you see the Great Wall of China in this little red line here. So that was attempting to protect them from northern invaders. So evil literally did come from the north. In addition, the city enters to the south since evil comes from the north. Emperors were considered divine and connected to the cosmos, so Feng Shui, wind and water, was very important for them. The first hall of supreme harmony, in which the emperor sat on his throne, also shows him as the son of heaven. He was the one responsible for maintaining order and harmony and balance in the universe, and even for maintaining crop success. The emperor lived in the hall of celestial purity. His throne was considered to be the center of the world. So a lot of pressure on the emperor, almost a semi-divine status. Beijing, as I've mentioned, is in the north of China, and I've actually had the chance to visit China twice in my life on a personal note. So we have Beijing up here on this map. My grandmother was actually born in Shanxi province, so her parents were missionaries from Norway, and that's where they were when she was born. And while she was there, and when she was 14 years old, her father died during World War II because he was helping and protecting Chinese civilians and soldiers. So the Japanese bombed their house specifically. And at that time, she was in school on the coast, and she ended up being in an internment camp in Shandong province, and was there for 3 years. It was actually the same internment camp where Eric Liddell, the star of Chariots of Fire, where he died. So there was a lot of significance for her. She left after World War II ended, came to the United States, and wasn't able to go back until the late 80s when China opened up again. And I got to go in 1991 along with my family, where a monument was unveiled for my great-grandfather, the one who died here in Shanxi province. So I had the first chance to go as a kid, and then the second time I was able to visit Beijing through an exchange program with my master's program at the University of Minnesota. They had a relationship with the Beijing Film Academy, and we went to Beijing through that program and visited all these same places, the Great Wall and the Forbidden City and all that. So I just wanted to mention a little bit of my family history in China. So as we're talking about geography, Beijing is in the north, and Suzhou is an important location also for the art that we're going to be looking at. And here's Shanghai. So let's turn now to Shenzhou, who lived in Suzhou, the city I mentioned, and he tried to capture the spirit of the literati Yuan painters. So there was this domination of Suzhou in the art scene. So I mentioned Suzhou here. So this painting, The Poet on a Mountaintop, it might not seem so, but the human person has become more significant. Previously, huge landscapes had very tiny people in them, but here the poet is prominent on the top of the mountain. He stands out a little bit more. He doesn't have anything around him, so he's a feature. The poem, in his mind, is written in the sky, and thus the mind, not the physical world, is the basis for reality. The mind and the landscape are harmonized. The landscape becomes an expression of the mind. The Garden of the Cessation of Official Life, also in Suzhou, is the largest surviving garden of the era. A frustrated official in Beijing quit his job and dedicated himself to leisure, that is, to painting, poetry, and calligraphy, as we mentioned. Dong Qichang was a theorist of literati painting. In Chan or Zen Buddhism in China, the southern school was radical and innovative, while the northern school of Zen Buddhism was traditional and conservative. So there's this division in Zen Buddhism between the northern and southern schools, and Dong related painting to these two schools in Buddhism. He called one school northern and one school southern, even if individual artists did not live in these particular regions necessarily. The professional court painters were of the northern or more conservative school, while the southern school was that of the literati. Northern professional painting prized technical skill and detail, as we've mentioned, looking here. The paintings were more decorative, while in the South, painting was about poetry and personal expression. Painting for Dong is not good because it accurately mimics the natural world, but because it expresses something beyond what we can simply see. Even the most realistic painting is still a painting. It still expresses something, and this, for Dong, is the power of painting. Thus, abstraction and the expressiveness of the brush are what really matter. As your book puts it, quote, "In a painting of a rock, the rock itself is not expressive. Rather, the brushstrokes that suggest the rock are expressive." That's on page 805. This relates to calligraphy, again, the highest art form in China, and calligraphy had for centuries been judged by the expressiveness of the brushwork, as well as the formal properties of composition. So expression in brushstrokes are important as an influence of calligraphy. Dongjicheng, the Qingbian Mountains from 1617, reveals this abstraction of nature, expressiveness through abstraction. The world of nature is purified through the artist's translation of it into ink. So the artist transforms and purifies the natural world in some way through his or her depiction. Space is flattened. So even if we can identify these artistic tropes of foreground, middle ground, and background, the distinctions between where the foreground ends and the middle ground begins are very ambiguous, not clear at all. There are 6 foreground trees that are forms that are repeated throughout the composition, and that's another way of sort of flattening the space. The gnarled tree on the left is mimicked across the river, and the dark trees are mimicked throughout the composition that goes all the way up. The boulder shape is also repeated on the mountain. So now turning to, here's the background. Korean art. In Korea, the Joseon dynasty looked to the Chinese Ming dynasty that we just looked at as its model. It rejected Buddhism for Neo-Confucianism, but in the 18th century, the silhak, or the practice of learning movement, emphasized studying Korean culture in addition to Chinese culture, so Korean culture became important again. The Diamond Mountains, as we can see here, actually look much as they do in this painting. The energy and the delicate and individualistic brushwork are also distinctly Korean. Now, throughout the 20th century, Korea experienced many hardships, including invasion and occupation by Japan during World War II, the Korean War, and this meant that Korea was somewhat isolated from developments in the 20th century around the world. But one particular artist, shown here, Kim Hwang-gi, went to Paris and then New York, creating for himself a style that is both Western and Korean. It is a painting that's abstract, made of dots and squares, and it's made of oil on canvas, which is Western media. But at the same time, it looks like monochromatic ink paintings from Korean tradition. And the delicacy and repetition of patterns are also distinctly Korean. Artists around the world face the challenge of developing their own styles in relation to the international art scene, as well as developing their styles in relation to the artistic traditions from their own cultures. And we will see a great variety of artists dealing with this dilemma as the course progresses.